Hello everyone, welcome to yet another day in this the clown decade, the decade where things are only going to get worse before they get better. And today we're taking a break from all the blackpilling of the world to talk about a debate that has been raging throughout the centre to right-wing spheres of the internet. And that is a debate on whether liberalism is good or bad. These debates mainly take place somewhere between the load-seaters types of right-wingers, such as Carl Benjamin or any of the other Load Seaters hosts, some of which I have talked to personally, and to the centre ground, which is where Adam and Sitch plant their flags as the arch-centrist liberals. And then you've got Short Fat Otaku, who's somewhere in between, and then Rags just happens to be in this video, so that's why he's on the thumbnail. I myself are somewhere between Short Fat Otaku and Carl on this debate. But there is a very, very irritating part of this debate that they keep getting stuck on, and that is defining liberalism. And I'm hoping that this video will just be a clarification of why that's basically a pointless argument. The thesis of this video is that liberalism is so widespread that basically everyone from the dissident right all the way up to communists, may as well just call themselves liberals because of how all-encompassing it is. Obviously that's a little bit of hyperbole on my part, but there is genuine justification to effectively call all these people liberals in one way or another. But first things first, I think we should go through exactly why I have decided to make this video finally. I really should have made it years ago. But recently Adam and Sitch, covering a chat with ContraPoints and some other leftist YouTuber, with Rags and Short Fat Otaku, and believe it or not, they ended up talking about liberalism again, and the disagreements about what it actually is, and whether it is good or not for governments to be liberal. So we may as well just jump right into this. Let's see where it goes.
I feel like every day we have every time Carl comes on, we had a debate about liberalism. But no,
he's out for liberalism. He hates liberalism's guts. He wants to drown it in the bathtub.
Already here, I have a bit of an issue. I think Carl really is a liberal at heart and still is. I think where this issue comes in is that liberalism has a lot of layers to it. You've got to bear in mind that as an idea, liberalism is 300 years old, over 300 years old. Obviously, over 3 centuries, it's not going to not evolve. It's not going to be influenced by outside forces. It's not going to be subverted, or not subverted, I should say. So this is the crux of the issue I want to get out there straight away. They're all liberals. Every single person on this podcast right now, and including Carl, who isn't on the podcast but they're talking about, they're all liberals. They're just at different layers of liberalism, and we'll go into what I mean there after they've had a bit more of a chat about it.
I know. He did that recent video promoting the Lotus Eaters. Like, what have I been doing recently? And he made like a 3-minute video where he said that he still likes liberal values, but there are some foundational principles that gotta go. And it's like, maybe that might be the case,
No, I'm with Dev so far here, insofar as there are some principles that need to go. Whether you call them foundational, again, that depends on your point of view. What Carl's main issue with, and I've done a live stream with my friend Jack from the Wellington Project where we have a critique of one of Carl's articles about 5 false assumptions of liberalism. And a point I make over and over and over again in this video is that what Carl is critiquing are very high levels of liberalism. They're the latest updates to liberalism, if you will. And I'm on Adam and Sitch's side insofar as you don't need to throw out all of liberalism with this. This is a particular level of liberalism. We can actually go back a few layers and try and find a different way to make liberalism work for us, for our different countries. Because obviously at the moment, current version we've got of liberalism that allows infinity migrants in every year and just assumes that it's okay to have a bunch of pro-Palestine marches with a bunch of people celebrating terrorism. Obviously that's not working. But through the different layers of liberalism that have successfully won the battle of ideas, if you want to put it that way, we have ended up at this state, and now is the time where we need to say, hang on, we've actually had about 100 or so years of really bad philosophy. We need to go back and rethink all this. Which is unironically what people like Enoch Powell and Margaret Thatcher were trying to do. It's just, you're pushing a rock up a hill because that many people are into this silly, high-level liberalism.
Maybe there are some things that are actually wrong,
give in.
Even though...
That's why you have to ban gay marriage, Dev, don't you know?
I want to ban gay marriage, but like there's a few things in the philosophical side of liberalism that are a bit
See, this is the thing, layers of liberalism. I wouldn't be shocked if Carl Benjamin wants to get rid of gay marriage. I want rid of gay marriage. Civil partnerships are fine. They are not a union with religious connotations. that's fine. But this is where the layers of liberalism come in. Obviously, there's a layer of liberalism where you can do what you want as long as it's not infringing others. That's pretty much at the base of it as well, in fact. Or at the very least, layer 2 or 3, and we'll go into detail on this later. But it's all a language game, it's all a definition game. It's Sitch's law, this. You can be a liberal and be against gay marriage. You can be a liberal and be for gay marriage. What will differ is what layer of liberalism you're on. And of course, we are assuming that we are on the path of progressive liberalism. The liberalism that ended up with identity politics. Because there's plenty of people, and as much as you can cope and say, oh, but they're woke and just communists. No, I'm afraid they are actually working in the liberal framework, and this is why you need to throw out some of the bathwater, but not necessarily the baby with it. But I want to go through a bit more of the debate before we get there.
Well, like the idea
Free
of fungibility.
speech?
No, fungibility is a bad liberal idea.
Like NFTs, I agree.
What is fungibility?
Well, fungibility, it means like replaceability. You know, it's like the idea that everyone can. There's the idea of like a universal man that can be extracted out and then put in any situation and just like completely adapt. It's like that doesn't really
That's
work.
not liberalism, man.
I'm afraid, Adam, that is liberalism. And it's the result of liberalism being a weird mixture of British and French ideas. It's the mixture of Rousseau and John Locke. Because at the end of the day, liberalism is trying to maximise liberty. And these layers of liberalism developed via trying to get to whatever the current philosopher or the philosopher thinking about liberalism or liberty saw as liberty. What did they define as liberty? And I think it's about now I should probably get into what I mean by these layers. So, everything I will be referencing I have developed from this book. Liberalism, a very short introduction, which is part of a series from the Oxford University Press that gives you very short and sweet introductions onto philosophical topics of your choosing, or even, I believe there's ones on physics and things like that. It's a very good series. The book was written by a Michael Frieden, who is a professor at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. Now, say what you will about SOAS, it is known as a very woke university, but this guy clearly knows his onions. And in chapter 1, called The House of Many Mansions, he introduces liberalism thus. When people first used the word liberal as a generous or ample, they had little idea of the mighty current liberalism was to unleash. Some indicate of its futures life emerged when liberal became associated with open-mindedness and tolerance, but ever since the term liberals was coined in Spain 200 years ago to represent a political party, liberalism has been positioned squarely on the public stage as a rallying cry for individuals desiring space to be free from unjustifiable limitations, and as a set of fundamental institutional arrangements meant to legitimate and civilise the practices of politics. Above all, it has become indicative of ideas and policies intended to reform, to emancipate, and to open up possibilities for individuals wishing to live their lives according to their own understandings. Like all ideologies and collectively held belief systems, liberalism competes over public recognition and implementation, and like all of them, it has been decried from numerous quarters. Yet the problem is this: there is no single, unambiguous thing called liberalism. And this is exactly what I want to get into, and what I want every single person in this debate to understand. When you say liberalism, you need to define what you mean. And how Michael Frieden describes liberalism, or analogizes liberalism, is the following. You have a big long road, a road going on for 200 to 300 years. This road is called liberalism. And at one side of the street you obviously start with what he also describes as the first layer of liberalism, the first house you will come to when you enter the street. You have a lovely Georgian house created in the late 17th century in England, and this is the liberalism of John Locke, the liberalism of contra-tyranny. This is your simple 2 treatises of government, and it is the basis from where all other liberalism derives. It is the basic philosophy that your liberty is you can do as you will within the reasonable boundaries of what you wish to do cannot infringe on other people's ability to do as they wish to do. You have the liberty to throw your fists about all you want, but that liberty stops at my nose. Though it's worth noting that this liberalism was obviously in a pre-democratic time, though it is also said it influenced the English Bill of Rights, which came about after the Glorious Revolution, in which there was an agreement with William III and the English elites at the time to say, look, you can be king, but your power will be very much limited compared to the arbitrary powers that Charles I, Oliver Cromwell, and their descendants had above the English. Having said that, most of these freedoms were only available to Protestants. But you can see where the initial idea of liberty came from. The second layer of liberalism was focusing massively on the liberty of the free market, best described by Richard Cobbin, who saw the free trade idea that which shall act on the moral world as the principle of gravitation in the universe, drawing men together, thrusting aside the antagonism of race and creed and language, and uniting us in the bonds of eternal peace, which is quite similar to some of the arguments made by libertarians such as Mises and Friedman, whose theory states that, well, if you're not racist, you are going to hire from a larger pool of potentially great workers and trade with more customers and suppliers, and therefore you are more likely to succeed. And that was the basis of freedom, that, okay, you are free to be all these sorts of bigotry in the free market, but with the free market you will see more freedom because ultimately anyone's money is as good as anyone else's. It was this type of liberalism that came out from the Manchester School that was mostly enforced by William Gladstone throughout the Victorian period. It also happened to see the greatest economic activity and rise in living standards that Britain ever saw. It's around here, by the way, where I would place myself. This is my layer of liberalism. However, in the next layer, we see John Stuart Mill in a lovely Victorian townhouse. And this is where freedom starts moving away from government, get out of my life, towards we can't truly be free as long as some people are oppressed. It is in this layer where John Stuart Mill and other philosophers of the mid-19th century wished for liberalism to focus on lifting everyone up to around the same standard. It was the type of liberty that wasn't just let me be free from the government and others, it was I cannot be free while I'm in poverty. And while I do agree with that to some extent, it is what opened the door to allow subversive or even minority voices that weren't necessarily beneficial to the rest of the individuals in a country to raise themselves up above the rest, by arguing that we should probably get rid of some of the societal limits we put on each other, but those limits are part of what allow us to be free from others' will. That wasn't necessarily what John Stuart Mill wanted, but it is certainly what opens the door to the next couple of layers, in which we have Leonard Hobhouse in an early 20th century red brick and mortar house. And this is where we start getting the unholy alliance of sociology and political philosophy, as this is where John Stuart Mill's idea that you cannot be truly free if you are in poverty is taken to the nth degree. It is the birth of the welfare state. While John Stuart Mill understood that the limits of government were still important in terms of liberalism, and his version of socialism was essentially just charity ramped up to 11, Hobhouse and other liberals of the turn of the 20th century started seeing the Manchester School as developed from the free trade house 2 layers down as immortalising greed and not particularly caring for the underclass. And so those in poverty needed state-funded welfare, and also saw the state as the vehicle to limit economic freedom, to limit monopolisations of certain sectors, which I will mention only started happening post-World War I, and wanted to turn away from the evolution of markets and instead have a benevolent state, as they thought it would fight imperialism and end poverty. And of course, ending poverty would mean that even more people would be liberated. So therefore you can call it liberalism, despite the fact a lot of people on layer 2 would probably call that socialism or communism. And now we get to the final layer, or at least the final layer for now. And this is Max Weber's layer. He was another sociologist who, in this case, has a 1960s British townhouse. This is quite direct in the politics of identity, and we'll get more of the sociologist injection into liberalism. And this was where you move away from the individual and move much more closer to the social groups, whether they are ethnic, class, religions, and so forth. This is really what swung open the door to allow the intersectional ideology into liberalism. It is these liberals who see that things like free speech have to be suppressed to allow marginalised groups to have their full liberty. It is here where intersectionality started coming into liberalism. It started with Max Weber even before the Weimar Republic fell, but then had his work translated further on in the Frankfurt School, and where the birth of sociology came from, with Max Weber and Marx's work being applied to that particular social science. And obviously liberalism developed from that. It literally took influence from Marx and people who hated liberalism. But the whole idea of it, the definition of liberty here, was to have the marginalised on the same level or above that of the majority groups of whatever the liberal state was. And that's the position we're in now. And that is the layer of liberalism that obviously me and everyone else in this conversation is against. So I hope that's all been made clear. What the real debate is around here is what layer of liberalism we want to throw out. For everyone here, obviously we want layer 5, the politics of identity just gone. Next up we have liberty through welfare. You would probably say that Adam and Sitch are both on this layer. They like that layer. Because this layer still appreciates the free market, it still sees it as a fundamental part of liberalism. It just needs a very good regulatory body watching over it to try and say, stop monopolies forming and things like that, while at the same time redistributing a bit of wealth to allow those in poverty to be raised up. I don't think it's a particularly unreasonable position, but it has, as Sargon, or Carl Benjamin, constantly says, open the door for the politics of identity. It did lay the groundwork for that next layer to come along, which is why people like me and Carl want to get rid of that one as well. We are not against helping those out in need. That's not what getting rid of that particular part means. You can tell that because that part of liberalism was developed after William Gladstone's government, which were essentially free trade put to the nth degree. And as mentioned before, it saw the highest rise in living standards, and a lot of people got out of poverty in that time, thanks to the Industrial Revolution, thanks to free trade and the free market. So that's where I am. It might be where Carl is, but Carl might be even further back and simply on contra-tyranny side, with a very pro-British outlook, which I have to agree with, obviously. And then when it comes to Short Fat Otaku, he's somewhere between development of individuality and liberty through welfare. He is between layer 3 and 4, probably leaning more to layer 3. And Rags is just Rags. Rags is probably liberty through welfare as well. It's hard to say. The biggest thing Rags does these days is EFAP, and there they are mainly talking about media. It would be up to Rags to let us know. But now that you've got this roadmap of liberalism in your head, I hope that it helps with the understanding of my criticisms of these debates. So let's get back to the debate.
The moral impetus behind something like immigration.
Make me bring up my notes.
That's not liberalism, man.
Is the idea
that has
that
nothing
you can
to do
bring,
with liberalism.
Hear me out. It's the idea that you can bring people in and they'll simply just become like you with no pushback, you know?
So yes, this is layer 5. This is the European influence on liberalism. This is the liberty of identity politics. It's the assumption that if everyone has the same level of freedom and is lifted out of poverty, say, or in this case, comes to the country of Britain, of Canada, of wherever, they will just automatically become like every other Canadian because their former oppression has gone. They are not under the oppression of their society, of their tyranny, to become like what they are. But the fact of life is that a lot of people do quite like being under tyranny. They just like being told what to do, and they will take the lessons from that old society with them. And this is the issue we're having with multiculturalism. But obviously Adam and Sitch are rejecting that this is liberalism because they think liberalism stopped at layer 4. It didn't. It's still continuing to this day. Because as long as you are arguing for some definition of liberty, you're a liberal. And that's all anyone is arguing for these days.
Because our culture is just that much better. It's like, well, no, they're going to hold on to some of their own culture. And some of that culture might be bad. It might even be anti-liberal. So it seems like liberalism does not have like very solid defense mechanisms against subversion right now.
No, and this is where Short Fat Otaku is mostly correct in his debates here, in his talking points here. The reason there's no defence in undercurrent liberalism against anti-liberal ideas being spread out is because we got rid of them in the name of a new liberalism. And as people like Mike Goodwin keep saying, it's the people who don't have to deal with these consequences who are sticking to layer 5 liberalism. A lot of other people, especially in the UK, are at layer 4 liberalism, where they want a huge welfare state and want the freedom to be free as Brits. And all Adam and Sitch have to do is understand that there are two different versions of liberalism at conflict there.
That's like an anti-immigration straw man of liberalism.
I think what you're talking about, that's an idea that's like a left-wing idea. That's not like an idea that's inherent to the philosophy of liberalism.
So here Sitch is correct. It's not inherent to liberalism if you're looking below layer 5. Layer 5 it is inherent. All the layers below that, Yeah, he's right. It's not inherent to that extent. However, if you then argue to Adam and Sitch that, say, democracy isn't an inherent liberal idea based on that argument, they will completely disagree because of this misunderstanding that liberalism is a long philosophical road and we are on one particular fork of that road, and what we really need to do is get back to, in my opinion, layer 2, but we at the very least need to go back from layer 5 to then develop a better evolution of liberalism. And that is essentially what the culture war is at the moment, but too many people are so attached to the word liberalism and want to call themselves liberals that they will be like Adam and Sitch and just not accept it.
Maybe so, but we have gotten here at this point, so.
Okay, but that's a different question.
I do hope Adam and Sitch actually do review this video, and by the way, if you are watching, I'm very sorry for calling you an F-slur on stream, Adam. I'd say in my defence, but this isn't a defence, it's just a horrible reasoning. I was on my second bottle of wine at that point. I will keep the drinking on stream to my own streams from now on. I guarantee I will not be doing that again. I still feel embarrassed, and it was a year ago. Anyway, back to the point at hand. Sitch and Adam do have to address this. They do just have to accept that this is liberalism, but they should be fairly comfortable with saying, yes, that is a layer of liberalism, and I want to throw out a lot of that bathwater, but keep my baby of the 4th layer. And then they will be arguing with Sargon past 2 whole layers to get back to the contra-tyranny layer right at the start, which is effectively where Sargon is. He might even be at the free trade portion, I'm not entirely sure, he doesn't talk too much about economics these days, but that's certainly where I am, and I think me and Sargon would agree on a lot more about liberalism than we disagree when we're talking about those 2 particular layers.
The next reading project for me is the book The True and Only Heaven by Christopher Latch. And he was like, he was a conservative.
Liberalism.
Well, hold on. He was a conservative who started, he started actually as a Marxist, then he became a liberal, then he became a conservative. And his view ultimately was that the liberal belief in unending progress ends up undermining liberalism itself, because it dismantles everything in the pursuit of progress.
I don't even think unending progress doesn't have anything to do with liberalism either.
Yeah, all this stuff has nothing. This was my critique of Karl.
I think at this point I need to read what is subtitled Liberal Dilemmas in the book Liberalism, a Very Short Introduction. The 5th layer constitutes a difficult terrain for liberals, interspersed as it was with some ethical and ideological quagmires. Its hallmarks are confusion and uncertainty precisely because it attempts to amalgamate incompatible sections of other layers. The incorporation of group diversity and uniqueness into the liberal lexicon has introduced a particularistic countercurrent that has partly eaten away at liberalism's former and challengeable pretensions to universalism. One could, of course, regard the current emphasis on the uniqueness of groups as an expansion of Mill's instance on the uniqueness of individuals, or at least of some individuals. With Mill, however, that wholly attractive diversity was not intended to revel in cultural diversity, but to protect eccentric individuals whose cultivation could enrich social life. 5th layer liberals are more hesitant. They are aware that, while much social diversity may indeed be celebrated, some has to be eyed warily. Notably, this new layer illustrates the typical disruptive and messy features of present-day liberalism, exemplified in liberal perplexity over recent high-profile debates. Those include arguments over female Muslim head coverings, the caricaturing of religious holy men, the persistent unequal status of women in many social spheres, or the introduction of gay marriages. The tensions between such liberal particularisms and liberal universalisms would have seemed unreasonable to pre-1914 new liberals who professed faith in the harmonious and organic unity of a liberal society. In other words, how this relates to what Dev was saying there by the author he was reading, the progress that they want to see, which in other words is as many of the minorities being lifted up to the status of what is essentially freeborn Englishmen as possible. You actually need to suppress the opinions of people who are against this sort of progress. And this doesn't have to be done by the government, obviously. We're seeing it with Graham Linehan, for example, going up against the trans radical activists. Liberalism, layers 1 to 4 of liberalism, are being completely undermined by layer 5 liberalism. In other words, sociologists who have told us that women can be men or men can be women have to have their opinions and policies put above that of the plebby Englishman. Or in other words, those who want to be layer 1 to 4 liberals. It's simply easier to try and put it in those words because of the way that the liberal road has been formed. It's mostly been developed by Englishmen and then later layers developed by people from other countries, where French ideas started to become more popular within them. Since the French left-wingers were becoming decidedly less violent in their revolutions, and therefore became more acceptable to the rest of the world.
I had this problem in our debate. Look, I had this problem with our debate with Carl, too, because Carl is like, look, Locke came up with this, therefore it is liberalism. I'm like, Locke wiped his ass, too. That doesn't mean wiping your ass is part of liberalism.
And yes, I am with Adam on this statement, in that John Locke indeed did believe in the blank slate. The main reason for that is probably because he never had kids. But Carl is under the wrong impression that because he believed in the blank slate, therefore John Locke believed that liberalism could be applied to all, which clearly isn't the case, because he developed it pretty much for Protestants only. Well, Protestant Englishmen only, when he first wrote the two treatises of government. So clearly, even from John Locke's own opinion, liberalism isn't supposed to be this universal type of philosophy that applies to everyone. It was specifically just for the English Protestants.
But you can't just come in and say, oh, some liberal that I plucked out of history thought this thing, and therefore I'm pinning it on liberalism.
Well, to be absolutely fair, liberalism does all derive from John Locke's work. That's where it all comes from. So to say he's just some random guy isn't quite the way to do it. It's a bit like saying, oh, you can't just pick out Jesus and things Jesus said and say that's Christianity. So you need to do a bit more work on arguing against this, I'll say, even though I am completely on your side of the debate there, because really the whole universal man liberalism can apply to everyone, will all be the same in the end, progress, progress, progress. That all really comes from Rousseau. It comes from the French influence on liberalism. You'll notice that I start to go off liberalism on that roadmap when foreign influence comes in and starts ruining it.
See, Adam, I actually agree with you, and that's probably the best argument against this point of view. It's the idea that even though a liberal writer might have written this at some point in time, there have been future liberal writers who have critiqued that. And also, liberalism is not just a set of political theories; it's also a practical political reality that we are living in.
That is correct. The main thing, again, that he is missing is the fact that it is a particular layer of liberalism. I apologise if I'm sounding like a broken record. I just want to get the point through pretty drastically, because I think it would be realistic to say, especially in Britain, that we have effectively only ever been living in different forms of liberalism since the 19th century. And in fact, probably even before. In fact, you could probably say that Britain has been a liberal society consistently ever since the Bill of Rights in 1689. We have just been experiencing every layer of liberalism since then to some degree. Hence, we've ended up in this particular level of liberalism where diversity and all that is pushed constantly, but to be fair, there are also large cohorts that are trying to go back to layer 4 and find a different route from there. I would love to go back a few other layers, but that's not going to happen, and I just have to accept that.
And when the theory doesn't line up with the reality, you have to take a look at that and be like, well, okay, what like how should we define liberalism now? Because we've tried certain tenets of it that haven't necessarily worked out that great.
Dev could have said that and pushed it, and hopefully it would then help Adam and Sitch understand their issue with this debate. Hence, I've made this video to try and expand on it, and hopefully they will watch it and understand that their layer 4 liberalism is still liberalism as much as layer 5 liberalism is still liberalism, and you just need to frame it as, we need to get rid of some of those core tenets of liberalism, just get them out of here and find a new path, which to be fair is what they're trying to do, but they are trying to do that in the wrong way. They're trying to do it by saying, that isn't real liberalism. In reality, all they're saying is that there's no true liberalism fallacy, and it's what's blocking them from delving further into their thought, I think.
And so I think that's why we have like neoliberalism, right?
Well, this is what I kept
some things.
This is what I kept trying to do with Carl. I kept saying, look, I came up in our debate, I came up with 6 proposals. I think that basically encompass all the ideas that are liberalism. I've added some to that sense because, obviously we're constantly talking about this, and other people say things like, well, isn't the consent of the governed, kind of part of liberalism? And I think, yeah, it probably is part of liberalism.
The consent of the governed isn't just probably a core tenet of liberalism, it is if not the core tenet of liberalism. The whole part of John Locke's second treatise of government is when it is actually justifiable to have a revolution, because obviously they didn't have democracy, or representative parliamentary democracy anyway, in the 1600s. And so John Locke basically says, look, if the government's infringing on you as a pleb, your only power really is to try and overthrow and have a revolution. So you're perfectly justified in doing that. The thing is that further down the line of liberalism, obviously, They wanted to have a bit less violence and a bit less of the risk of revolution, so they brought in democracy. And yet, obviously, we can have a massive debate on the issue with democracy from then. We'll try and stick with what is being said in this debate.
I mean, I pretty much like. I think this is actually the proper pushback on, let's say, Sargon's ideas when he says, "Well,
but
this is what liberalism originally meant," and it's like, well, it doesn't necessarily matter.
Look,
what the thing. Meant.
So, for those who didn't quite catch what Dev said, he's saying that Carl says that, look, here are quotes of what liberalism originally means, obviously quoting John Locke, and Dev's saying, well, that doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter what liberalism originally meant. The fact of the matter is that it does, because it all delves from different definitions of liberty. So the original definition of liberty does matter if you're trying to get back to layer 1 of liberalism, which Carl is trying to do. I'm trying to get back to layer 2. Obviously, layer 1 and layer 2 really aren't that different. It's just layer 2's a lot more focused on the free market than freedom from tyranny in general. But when you're all the way up to layer 4 and 5 and trying to debate between those two, yeah, it kind of does matter if you're trying to bring it all the way back to layer 1. But the fact of the matter is that none of the Americans and Canadians really care to go back that far, because their country was created 100 years after layer 1 was conceived. In other words, Adam and Sitch, Proto-America has it right. You need to start getting lessons from Proto-America.
And this is my critique of what Carl is doing too, because he keeps trying to put these things in that bunch of things that don't belong. Like you just said, this idea that human beings are culturally interchangeable. No one's ever tried to put that in the bag.
Pretty much all the sociologists who were at the same time liberal philosophers have tried to do that. And when they found out it wasn't working, their theory was that that's simply because these different groups that are oppressed cannot become like the others because they're being oppressed by the majority group. That's where the theory all comes from. That's layer 5 liberalism, and that's their solution to it. And as much as you want to say that's not liberalism, I'm afraid you just have to accept it is. You just have to accept that you're trying to bring them back down a layer to the 1920s house rather than the 1960s house.
Like, I think liberalism wants to have a certain amount of tolerance for different beliefs, but I don't think a liberal believes that tolerance is infinite.
Yes, but this is where the issue comes in yet again. It's layer 4 and 5 of liberalism showing their different types of tolerance, or different limits of tolerance. Layer 5 has a lower limit of tolerance for the right wing, the nationalist types of the United Kingdom, or, well, the other countries obviously, and layer 4 liberalism has less tolerance of those who are not willing to integrate when they've immigrated there. But at the end of the day, it's all still liberalism. And I think at that point I will just be repeating myself far too much for this video to be of any more value. But I hoped after having watched this video, you will be able to watch Adam and Sitch and realise that this is not a liberalism versus some foreign ideology type of debate. It is a internal conflict of liberalism. Because effectively, every argument we have had over the past century at the very least, has been between layers 4 and 5 of liberalism. But just to conclude, I think it's in everyone's interest in this debate to read Liberalism a very short introduction, just to get the idea of where they're going wrong with their outlook on the debate. Effectively, it does all come down to definitions, and absolutely everyone in this debate just has to accept that different layers of liberalism have, in their mind, completely intolerable assumptions. In my opinion, you start getting intolerable assumptions with John Stuart Mill's type of development of liberalism by forcibly removing people from their oppression. I mean, I'm obviously against the type of oppression of coercion or government or other people or whoever's doing the coercion. However, I don't think you are not fully at liberty just because you are poor. In fact, I think you will feel obviously most at liberty getting yourself out of that poverty. We are seeing far too many examples of people who are being taken off the streets and given apartments only to find themselves in a worse state in a few weeks because they simply can't hack it. For whatever reason, they leave their apartment, they leave it empty, and they're on the streets again because, well, it's hard to say. It's up to the psychologists to figure that out. And then obviously you get to the whole liberalism of the welfare state, which takes John Stuart Mill's get everyone out of poverty to the nth degree, which some people call socialism, but I'm not going to go that far because it is under the tenets of liberalism, which at its heart is just trying to get liberty for as many people as possible. And obviously, every single one of us can agree that we can reject layer 5, which brings group-based liberty into the equation, and inevitably ends up oppressing groups via the government and via coercion. Like most philosophy, liberalism is internally inconsistent. Due to the irrational nature of the human mind, there's always going to be conflict within ideologies. However, we just need to accept that there are different layers to liberalism, and at the end of the day, we are just rejecting different tenets of different layers of liberalism. Trying to call it something else and having debates over whether tis, tat, or t'other is liberalism or not is absolutely pointless. If at the end of the day, the objective is to have liberty, whether it's for the individual, whether it's for the group, whether it's for whoever, you are arguing for liberalism. The word is literally derived from the Latin libertas, meaning freedom. As soon as you make it clear who your highest priority for that freedom is, you'll be absolutely fine in having these debates. However, for now, we have had a 2-year-long debate over what liberalism is and isn't, and at the end of the day, it turns out literally everybody's wrong, apart from me. So hopefully everyone mentioned this video watches this video and picks up a copy of Liberalism, A Very Short Introduction. I would very much recommend it. I have a link to it down in the description. Please check it out. It is one of the best books for understanding this topic that I have ever read, and it's literally only 100 pages long. So with that, that's everything I had for you today. Once again, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.